The Nazis once mocked an American fighter as too fat to fly, until they tore it apart and discovered something that stunned their entire engineering corps. Today's story is unlike anything you've ever heard. In early September 1944, on a remote airfield near the western coast of occupied France, Hauptfeldwebel Erich Kappel, Chief Technical Officer of Kampfgeschwader 54, received a report that should have been a triumph. An American A-92 Hammerbolt had been forced into an emergency landing after sustaining damage during a skirmish with German interceptors. The pilot had been taken alive. Even more importantly, the aircraft itself remained largely intact. For Kappel, who had spent months studying American combat performance only through second-hand accounts, this was nothing short of an intelligence windfall. German pilots had been encountering this new American fighter for nearly a year, often describing it with a mixture of ridicule and frustration. They called it grotesque, bloated, a machine that looked more like a flying fuel container than a fighter. Yet, despite its bulk, it climbed relentlessly and performed at altitudes where German machines struggled to breathe. Those contradictions made it an enigma that Kappel, an engineer by training, was now finally able to confront directly. When he first stepped onto the tarmac and saw the A-92 Hammerbolt sitting under the overcast sky, his initial reaction matched that of every Reichsfliegerkorps pilot who had seen one up close. The machine looked absurd. Its fuselage was thick and rounded. Its nose housed a radial engine so large it seemed fused into the airframe. Fully loaded, the aircraft weighed over 9.5 tons, more than double the mass of the German Falk FW-210, which stood at a modest 4.3 tons. To those accustomed to sleek, lightweight interceptors, the A-92 appeared to defy aerodynamic sense. It was no wonder pilots had mockingly nicknamed it the Fliegen Ton, the flying barrel. But Kappel did not care about appearances. His training demanded that he ignore aesthetic judgments and focus on measurable performance. Beneath its awkward exterior, the American fighter hid secrets embedded in machining tolerances, materials, airflow design, and mechanical integration. Numbers did not lie, and Kappel trusted mathematics more than he trusted any ideology or field rumor. As his crew began removing the engine cowling, a long silence settled over the inspection team. Exposed before them was the Cooper & Haynes R-2950 Cyclone Star, an 18-cylinder, two-row radial engine unlike anything Germany had managed to mass-produce. The sheer size of it explained the aircraft's swollen nose profile, yet size alone was not what stunned Kappel. It was the quality. Every cylinder head appeared machined with almost surgical precision. The crankcase was immaculate, lacking the rough finishing marks common in many late-war German engines. Even the ignition harnesses and fuel distribution lines were arranged with a clarity that spoke of industrial abundance. Kappel pulled out his notebook and began rough calculations. With a displacement significantly greater than the German radial engines and a robust mechanical configuration, he estimated the Cyclone Star delivered at least 2,350 horsepower, and likely more when coupled with the American high-altitude boosting system. By comparison, the German Rheinmetall 1520R, the power plant of the FW-210, delivered around 1,520 horsepower at peak output. The Americans, it seemed, were manufacturing engines with nearly 50% more usable power, and they were doing it on a scale Germany could not hope to match. Yet the numbers were only part of the revelation. As Kappel examined the engine internals more closely, he saw no signs of material substitutions, no low-grade alloys, no simplified bearings, none of the compromises German factories increasingly relied on as resources dwindled. The Americans were using top-tier aluminum alloys, advanced heat-resistant steel, and bearings that reflected an astonishing level of consistency. One of Kappel's mechanics, a veteran who had spent years repairing frontline fighters, tapped one of the Cyclone Star's cylinders and said quietly, "Every cylinder can be removed individually, Herr Hauptfeldwebel. You could replace one section without tearing the whole engine apart." Kappel nodded slowly. The logic was brilliant. It meant faster repairs, easier logistics, and higher sortie rates. German engines, by contrast, required deep partial disassembly for many types of internal repairs, an acceptable compromise early in the war, but an unsustainable one in 1944 when skilled labor was scarce and airfield resources stretched thin. But there was a far more disturbing discovery waiting for him deeper inside the Hammerbolt's fuselage. Running from the engine exhaust manifold, down the lower fuselage tunnels, and into the aircraft's belly was a complex network of heat-shielded ducting. At their terminus sat a compact, beautifully machined turbine, part of the American Thermoboost Turbine X turbo-supercharging system. German intelligence had reported on American turbo technology, but seeing the device installed in a production fighter was another matter entirely. The turbine, capable of spinning at 23,500 revolutions per minute, used exhaust gases to compress intake air and maintain engine power at altitudes where German fighters were gasping. It required alloys Germany struggled to produce, bearings Germany could not machine consistently, and labor Germany no longer possessed. German engineers had experimented with turbo systems, but none had ever reached operational service. The manufacturing demands were simply beyond reach. With the Thermoboost system installed, the A-92 Hammerbolt could maintain near maximum engine output above 28,500 feet, a realm of thin air where German interceptors like the FW-210 and Sturmjäger 112 suffered steep performance drops with their mechanically driven compressors. Where German fighters began to lose their agility and speed, the Hammerbolt was just beginning to show its full potential. Kappel's assistant finally asked the question hanging over the entire inspection. "Can we build something like this?" Kappel shook his head. "Not with our current industrial capacity. Not with our materials. Not with our manpower. This entire system requires precision and resources we simply do not have." He did not need to say the rest. The conclusion was obvious. The Americans weren't just building a better fighter. They were building a fighter born from an industrial world Germany could not rival. Thick clouds drifted overhead as Kappel stood back, absorbing the reality before him. He had only begun his inspection of the aircraft, and yet the implications of what he had already seen were staggering. The A-92 Hammerbolt was not a prototype. It was not a limited-run experiment. It was one of thousands produced monthly in quantities that dwarfed Germany's total output across all fighter models combined. Kappel closed his notebook and stared at the captured fighter. For the first time, he understood that this machine, this ungainly, overbuilt, impossibly powerful beast, was a symbol of something far larger than air combat. It was a manifestation of an industrial war Germany had already lost, even if few within the Reich were willing to accept it. The morning after examining the engine and the Thermoboost Turbine X, Hauptfeldwebel Erich Kappel returned to the captured A-92 Hammerbolt with a clearer sense of purpose and a growing sense of dread. He had already uncovered enough to know the American fighter represented an industrial leap his nation could not match. But the exterior and internal structure of the aircraft remained to be studied, and Kappel was determined to document every detail, no matter how unpleasant the implications. When he climbed onto the wing, he took a long look at the Hammerbolt's fuselage. It bore the scars of combat. Several cannon hits from 20mm German shells, dozens of perforations from machine gun rounds, and long gouges along the portside stabilizer. Any German aircraft suffering similar abuse, Falk FW-210, Sturmjäger 112, or even the newer experimental interceptors, would have been uncontrollable long before reaching the ground. Yet this American machine had not only survived, it had landed under control. Kappel crouched down near a section of torn fuselage skin. The metal was significantly thicker than what he was used to seeing on German fighters. The internal frame beneath, a robust lattice of ribs and spars, had absorbed the damage without catastrophic failure. Even more astonishing was the redundancy built into the control systems. Where German fighters used single cable runs for certain control surfaces, the Hammerbolt used multiple parallel lines, each isolated and shielded. Even if two of these were severed, Kappel muttered, the pilot would still have partial control. One of his technicians called to him, Herr Hauptfeldwebel, look at this armor plate. Kappel stepped toward the cockpit. Surrounding the pilot's seat were thick, curved plates of hardened alloy. The Americans had not hesitated to add weight in the name of survivability. German designers could not afford such luxuries. Every kilogram allocated to armor meant sacrificing speed or climb performance. But the Americans, armed with engines producing 2,350 horsepower, had the freedom to over-engineer for durability. And they used that freedom with brutal clarity. The windscreen of the Hammerbolt was another revelation. It was thicker than any Kappel had ever seen on a frontline fighter, nearly twice the thickness of the armored glass on the Sturmjäger 112. It shimmered with a faint tint, evidence of specialized lamination. A German pilot hit by even a glancing shot in a Bf-109's cockpit often suffered fatal wounds from glass shards or penetrating fragments. The American pilot, shielded by layers of reinforced transparency, would likely survive similar encounters. Kappel examined the radial engine from the front again. The Cyclone Star's circular configuration acted as an enormous shield, protecting the pilot and critical systems. German inline engines relied on liquid cooling, efficient but fragile. A single puncture to the coolant line or radiator usually doomed the aircraft within minutes. The Hammerbolt's engine, by contrast, could lose 2 or 3 cylinders and still limp home. Kappel had read field reports describing American fighters returning with entire cylinders shot away, their engines still rotating with stubborn determination. He now saw no reason to doubt those accounts. Moving to the wings, he found the weapon bays. Inside were mounted the 10 HX-12 heavy burst 13mm machine guns, 5 in each wing. Each gun carried 350 rounds, giving the aircraft a total ammunition load of 3,500 rounds. Kappel ran the numbers. With all guns firing simultaneously, the Hammerbolt unleashed 115 rounds per second, a torrent of high velocity. Slugs capable of shredding anything in its path. A standard German Falk FW-210 carried far less ammunition and relied heavily on its limited capacity cannons. Deadly, yes, but restricted by barrel heat and scarce rounds. A German pilot often expended his ammunition load in just a few short bursts and was forced to disengage. The Hammerbolt could sustain multiple engagements before coming close to empty. Kappel studied the ammunition belts. The rounds were heavy, well-jacketed, and designed for reliability under high rates of fire. Each belt was neatly linked, lacking the rough joins that sometimes plagued German late-war ammunition production. Quality control was clearly not an issue for American factories. With a full complement of 10 synchronized weapons converging at a calculated distance ahead of the nose, the Hammerbolt could reduce even a heavily armored aircraft to twisted fragments in seconds. Head-on attacks would be suicide, Kappel said quietly as he wrote in his notebook. His analysis of the aircraft's durability and firepower only reinforced a pattern he could no longer ignore. The Americans were not merely producing better airplanes. They were producing them in quantities and with material confidence Germany could not remotely approach. To confirm this, Kappel requested additional intelligence reports from Berlin. Within hours, teleprinter messages arrived at the airfield. Production estimates for American aircraft were worse, far worse, than any he had previously assumed. The documents stated that factories in the United States were pushing out 620 to 950 Hammerbolts per month, depending on plant shifts and resource allocations. In total, more than 17,800 of the type had already been built or scheduled for completion. The industrial centers producing the R-2950 Cyclone Star engine were even more staggering. Over 138,000 units projected through the next year. By comparison, all of Germany's single-engine fighter plants combined were managing between 210 and 330 aircraft per month, often disrupted by fuel shortages, labor problems, and constant Allied bombing. Even optimistic projections placed the Reich's total engine output at a fraction of what the Americans achieved. Reading the numbers, Kappel felt something collapse inside him. A quiet, private acknowledgement of a truth he had tried to resist. Germany was no longer competing in a war of machines. It was struggling against an avalanche of steel, aluminum, manpower, and resources unlike anything Europe had ever seen. He flipped to a clean page in his notebook and wrote a sentence he knew would be controversial, perhaps even dangerous. Technical and numerical superiority of the A-92 Hammerbolt indicates the Reich cannot sustain current air combat strategy. He paused. Then, with reluctance, he added, recommend re-evaluating all high-altitude engagements. Continued losses inevitable. Kappel closed the notebook, aware that these words, though accurate, would not be welcomed by those above him. The Reichsfliegerkorps wanted reassurance, not mathematics. Ideology demanded victory, not analysis. But numbers did not bow to ideology. And the Hammerbolt, sitting battered yet defiant on the airfield, was physical proof that Germany faced an opponent whose industrial might dwarfed its own. For the next several days, Hauptfeldwebel Erich Kappel worked tirelessly, compiling his findings on the A-92 Hammerbolt into a structured, comprehensive technical document. He approached the task with the same meticulous precision he applied to every mechanical analysis. But as the pages accumulated, he realized that he was not merely cataloging hardware. He was documenting the evidence of an industrial war his country had already lost. The deeper he delved into the airframe, the more the pattern repeated. American abundance versus German scarcity, American resilience versus German fragility, American mass production versus German improvisation. The Hammerbolt's internal fuel tanks were another surprise. They were self-sealing, multi-layered reservoirs that could absorb hits from small and medium-caliber rounds without igniting. In contrast, German fighters, especially the Sturmjäger 112, had fuel systems that were notoriously vulnerable to incendiary strikes. Pilots often perished when a single round penetrated a tank and engulfed the fuselage in flame. The Hammerbolt minimized that risk through layers of protective rubber, fabric reinforcement, and thick outer plating. Even the electrical wiring demonstrated American industrial reach. The cables were uniformly insulated, using synthetic polymers Germany struggled to acquire in meaningful quantities. The connectors were standardized, rugged, designed for rapid replacement. In German aircraft, inconsistent materials and last-minute production substitutions often resulted in brittle lines prone to failure under stress. Then there was the landing gear. The Hammerbolt's gear was massive, heavily reinforced, and capable of withstanding hard landings on rough, improvised strips. German pilots frequently lost aircraft due to fragile gear collapsing on uneven fields. But the Americans built for abuse, assuming that chaotic battlefield conditions were the norm rather than the exception. Everything Kappel touched told the same story. As he examined the nose cowling for the third time, one of his team members, Lieutenant Riedel, spoke in a low voice. "Sir, it feels like they built this machine with no concern for material limits." Kappel replied without looking up. "That is because they had none. Their factories have more aluminum than we could dream of right now." Riedel hesitated. "Do you think Berlin knows this?" Kappel finally lifted his eyes. "They know. They simply refuse to believe it." By the third evening, his report reached more than 30 pages of tightly written analysis, far longer than typical aircraft evaluations. It contained schematic sketches, production comparisons, flight performance extrapolations, and tactical recommendations. Section after section reinforced conclusions that would be politically inconvenient for any officer in the Reich to acknowledge. But the most dangerous part was the final assessment, the part he could not avoid writing. Kappel drafted it slowly, weighing each sentence with the caution of a man aware that numbers could be seen as treason when they contradicted ideology. The A-92 Hammerbolt represents not merely an aircraft of superior power and durability, but the manifestation of a production system operating at a scale the Reich cannot match. The enemy's ability to manufacture machinery of this complexity in quantities exceeding 900 units per month indicates overwhelming industrial strength. Direct attrition against such forces will lead to irrecoverable losses. Prolonged high-altitude engagements advise reliance on ambush tactics, low-altitude interception, and energy conservation maneuvers. The Hammerbolt's endurance, firepower, and structural resilience. Pragmatic understanding. Voss read the report in silence, flipping back and forth through the densely written pages. When he finished, he exhaled heavily and looked at Kappel with a mix of sympathy and resignation. "You know Berlin will not appreciate this," Voss said. "They want evidence of American weakness, not strength." Kappel swallowed. "The truth does not change because it is inconvenient." Voss tapped the cover of the report. "Perhaps, but the High Command does not reward officers who deliver pessimism, especially now when morale is already strained." Kappel felt a surge of frustration. "Sir, we're facing machines backed by factories capable of producing 342,000 aircraft in a few years. They have already built 138,000 Cyclone Star engines. How can we compete when we struggle to maintain production of a few hundred fighters per month?" "This is not pessimism, it is mathematics." Voss nodded slowly. "And mathematics is precisely what they do not wish to hear." A heavy silence fell, the kind that carries unspoken truths. Finally, the Oberstleutnant stood, handed the report back and said quietly, "I will forward it, but be prepared. You may be called to justify your conclusions, and the questions will not be gentle." 3 weeks later, word returned through informal channels. Not an official response, not an acknowledgement, only murmurs carried by officers who drifted between command posts. One comment, delivered secondhand, summed up the sentiment in Berlin. "This engineer has allowed enemy propaganda to cloud his assessments that contradicted its worldview. Patriotism was measured not in truthfulness, but in conformity." What struck him, however, was something deeper, the growing realization that the Reichsfliegerkorps was not simply losing a tactical battle, it was losing the ability to tell itself the truth. For the rest of the month, Kappel observed the skies as more and more A-92 Hammerbolts appeared over occupied territory. Their numbers increased weekly. German pilots returned with stories of heavy losses, of duels decided by firepower and altitude rather than skill alone. Experienced aces were shot down by opponents they never had a chance to outclimb or outlast. The attrition he predicted had already begun, and every passing day confirmed what the Hammerbolt had told him at first glance. Germany was attempting to fight a war of engines, fuel, and factories with dwindling resources and unyielding ideology. The mathematics were simple. The consequences were devastating. Winter approached as Hauptfeldwebel Erich Kappel continued his technical duties across occupied airfields, inspecting damaged aircraft, drafting maintenance protocols, and monitoring performance reports from frontline squadrons. Yet none of these tasks carried the same gravity as the evaluation of the captured A-92 Hammerbolt. The conclusions he had drawn from that single machine shadowed every subsequent inspection. The more American aircraft he examined in the months that followed, the more he realized the Hammerbolt had not been an anomaly. It had been a warning. A warning the Reich had refused to heed. A captured C-57 Atlas transport, shot down after wandering off course during a night mission, offered another glimpse into American production capacity. It was enormous, spacious, robust, built from alloys Germany could no longer procure in quantity. The airframe was so well engineered that the aircraft had remained partially intact even after crash landing. In a field, its serial number suggested it was one of over 12,000 constructed, a quantity that dwarfed the entire German transport fleet. Later, Kappel inspected a downed P-72 Long Lance, optimized to win a prolonged, resource-intensive conflict. Every aircraft told the same story. America's industrial power was not only vast, it was accelerating. The numbers pouring through. Intelligence channels grew more astonishing each week. Total projected American aircraft production was expected to exceed 342,000 units, while the Reich struggled to push beyond 88,500, many of which were late-war models built with inferior materials and inconsistent workmanship. German factories, once symbols of precision, were now held together by forced labor, dwindling supplies, and frantic improvisation. The Reich's leadership attempted to reassure the public and military alike that superior tactics, pilot skill, and determination would compensate for material shortages. But skill could not replace aluminum, willpower could not increase fuel reserves, and ideology could not manufacture aircraft engines out of thin air. Numbers were indifferent to optimism. In early 1945, Kappel was summoned to a debriefing conducted by an American technical intelligence unit following the collapse of German lines in the West. To his mild surprise, the American officers treated him with professional respect. Their questions focused not on politics but on engineering. One officer, a major with a background in industrial management, placed a copy of Kappel's report on the A-92 Hammerbolt on the table between them. The cover bore markings indicating it had been retrieved from a Berlin archive. Did you truly conclude from examining a single aircraft that Germany couldn't win an industrial war against the United States? The major asked. Kappel sat silently for a moment before answering. I concluded that we did not possess the manufacturing capacity. Not in manpower. I did not conclude that we would lose militarily. I concluded that we could not win mathematically. The major nodded thoughtfully. Your report states, continued attrition will result in unsustainable losses. Berlin marked it as filed, no action required. Did that surprise you? Kappel gave a weary smile. No. The Reich did not reward those who delivered inconvenient truths. It rewarded those who reinforced its confidence. What he did not say, though he suspected the Americans already understood, was that several German intelligence officers, engineers, Logisticians and analysts had reached similar conclusions. But the system they served valued ideology above evidence, willpower above logistics, declarations above data. In the final weeks of the war, as American aircraft dominated the skies in overwhelming numbers, filling horizons with Hammerbolts, long glances, bombers, and transports, Kappel felt the full weight of that failure. Not merely the failure to match American production, but the failure of a nation to acknowledge reality when it mattered most. The Reich had believed that superiority of belief, culture, or determination would outweigh the raw material calculus of war. But the skies over Europe told a different story. A story of machining tolerances, fuel reserves, steel tonnage, and the productivity of factories operating 3 shifts without interruption. The war had been decided long before the battles were fought. The moment Germany faced a nation capable of producing 138,000 engines like the Cyclone Star while still building ships, tanks, and trucks in staggering quantities, the outcome became inevitable. In the quiet months after the surrender, Kappel reflected often on the captured A-92 Hammerbolt. That ungainly, over-engineered, brutally powerful aircraft had been more than a machine. It had been a message, one written not in propaganda, but in metallurgy, horsepower, and production quotas. A message that the Reich had refused to read. The Hammerbolt had survived hits, flown through storms, outclimbed opponents, and endured damage that would annihilate any